Okay, so I wanted to show you a few tips and ideas on things, on some of those things that I see often as problems, specifically with typography and layout. And I hope that you can apply some of these suggestions and solutions to your projects that you're working on this week. Some of the things that I want you to consider is font usage. I talked about this when it came to the resumes, but try to stay away from the office fonts, the ones that are already loaded on your computer and that become overused, and especially the ones that are the more fanciful fonts there, because there are so few. They really get overused, and they kind of tend to label your projects and make them look a little bit more common. So if you go instead and go and use the Adobe fonts that I showed you last week, you'll find a lot more options, and you'll be able to tailor them better to the look and feel of your project. Also, some other things that I'll be demonstrating and discussing is headlines and hierarchy. Many times in magazines, I see headlines that are not big enough. If you just take a look at publications in general, you want the headline to be big and bold and very eye-catching, so that it's obvious to the reader that that's where the article starts, and also that it catches people's attention. There's also lots of typography and paragraph issues that I see along the way. These are very detail-oriented. Typography is very detail-oriented, but it's also something that really shows your professional skills. That's usually the biggest difference between somebody who has training and education and somebody who doesn't, is the way that they handle text and typography, just because it is kind of those finer details of design. So be sure to go through those resources that I posted in the announcements about typography rules and common mistakes, and I'll be going over a few of those in my demos as well. You also want to really be careful and aware of text and image relationships. That includes whenever you are putting text on top of an image, to make sure that it's still readable, depending on what the background image is. You also don't want to create conflict between the audience trying to read the text and trying to see the picture. Be aware of that. Anytime that you're putting text on top of imagery, you are creating that conflict. The audience has to kind of decide, do I want to look at the picture? Do I want to read the text? And that becomes something that kind of hinders the communication. So if you're using that, you want to make sure that the text is on a part of the image where the background is very solid and even, so that it doesn't interfere with them either looking at the picture and getting that stuff, or reading the text. Also, text and image relationships, when it comes to just being in columns or in a grid, you want to make sure that there's always a little bit of space between your text and the edge of an image or a solid background square or any kind of graphic component, so that doesn't, so that the text has enough room to breathe and it's still easy to read. Also, when it comes to images, you remember that you are not limited to the images that you were given for the assignment. If you want to go above and beyond those, push things a little bit, make your design a little bit more unique, you can look at alternatives that might work better with your concept. And also think about the way that you're cropping images. Just placing the image in a box the way that you received it is not always the most interesting way to present that image. Think about what that image is trying to communicate, the reason and the purpose for that image, and look and see if you can crop it in a different way that makes it work better for your layout composition or just for the interest of the image itself. And be extremely careful not to distort images or text for that matter. That's one of those very big no-nos that are going to be noticed right off the bat by an employer, and they will probably send you down the road right away if they see that you are stretching or squishing images or text. All right, so a few things that I'm going to wanted to demonstrate in InDesign so that you kind of see the solutions to some of these problems is the sizing and cropping of images, the placing text on images, headlines, padding, text wrap considerations, that's something else that you need to think about. Paragraph separations, text and flow, and bullet tabs. Remember that in your projects, you do not want to have any kind of placeholder text. If your project that you did in class still has that filler text, that kind of nonsense text, then you want to replace that with something that makes sense. Otherwise, it looks way too much like kind of a template or a mock-up, and it doesn't look like a finished design. I would also recommend that you do not put images behind paragraph text. Sometimes you can get away with having like a pull quote or something larger or a headline go across images, but paragraph text is usually a lot, much too small to have on top of image. Something else that I see a lot and becomes kind of a pet peeve, I would say, is when people put first line indents on their paragraphs, even though they have space between the paragraphs as well. When you have those first line, when you have space between your paragraphs, you do not need that first line indent. Remember that there's different ways to separate paragraphs, and one technique is enough. Otherwise, you usually disrupt the flow and the alignment of the text too much. And of course, you want to try to avoid widows. There's times when you have to kind of make a choice. If you're not able to change the font, or you're not able to, you start trying to fix one widow and it causes other problems down the road in your text, then sometimes that is the least harmful option. But there are several different ways to try to get rid of those widows, and I think usually just changing the tracking of your body copy in your paragraph settings, your paragraph styles, is usually the least intrusive way to get rid of widows. But you can always try that. You can try changing the font. You can try either adding or removing hyphens, and those are usually some of the least invasive ways to try to get rid of those widows. And again, hyphens, that's something that there are some different schools of thoughts on this. Some people say they do not want any hyphens, but sometimes that can also create very irregular, ragged edges for your paragraphs that are also not very aesthetically pleasing. So hyphens can help with that. If you are using justified text, then you almost always have to have hyphens in there, or it's going to really wreak havoc with the way that the text becomes justified. Sometimes this also changes from font to font, because the software that the font is designed as has different kinds of settings and built-in ways that it handles like hyphens and justified text and those kinds of things. So some of those things you're just going to have to look at on an individual basis to try to kind of solve. All right, so let's take a look at some of these demos with our example layout here in InDesign. So I have a layout right here that we're going to try to fix. You probably see right off the bat some different kind of issues, and that this, you know, needs to be worked over a little bit to look professional. Okay, so together I'm going to show you some tips that you can use to fix some of these different problems, and you can adapt that, I hope, to the projects that you're working on. All right, so first of all, let's just take a look at this image right here. You can see, I can see at least, that it has been squished just and distorted just a little bit. Sometimes that can be hard to see. It kind of depends on what the image is of. If it has like a face or an animal or you know, something that you can easily tell if it's been distorted, then it's, you know, really bad. And you want to make sure that it gets straightened out. If you, sometimes it can be kind of subtle. So if you're not quite sure if it's been stretched or not, one way that you can tell is if you go to your links panel and you select the image and you look down here at the bottom at the dimensions, if it has dimensions that are something by something and it doesn't have a PPI right here, then you know that it's been distorted in some way or another. So that's one way to tell. And once it's been distorted, it's really hard to be able to get it back to normal with your different, you know, fitting mechanisms and stuff like that. So I recommend that if you do that, just remove it and then replace it. That's what I would do, because it's really hard for you to know exactly how much it's been distorted once you've put it in there. So what I think you ought to do in this case with this image is just remove this image and create a new box. And then when you are placing this image in here, make sure, so I'm just going to find the original image here. And you can see now how, you know, what this is supposed to look like. And then when you are placing it in here, make sure that your fitting that you are choosing for it is that you always fill things proportionately, okay? So you can fill the frame proportionately, you can fit the content proportionately, you can fit the frame to the content, but you never want to fit the content to the frame, because then if your frame isn't the same dimensions, that's when you run into these issues, okay? So if we fill the frame proportionately, it will stay intact. And then if you then want to change the look of it or the crop of it, you can do that by hovering over this and, you know, changing either how the image has been cropped in here or the size of the image itself inside that frame. But this is also the other instance where you can make this a little bit more interesting by having a crop that is maybe a little off-centered or you know, a little closer in or something like that to make your image a little bit more interesting for the audience. All right, so that is one thing. Now, The other thing, when you come to the image right here, you always want to think about your grid. Notice how this image is just kind of sticking out just a little bit into this paragraph line right here, which is making these lines a little bit too short, and it's just a little awkward. It's just halfway in there and not really fitting with the grid. So I would probably recommend that you again either have the image follow the grid, so go all the way out to the second column right here, and stick with your grid there. Now, of course, you're going to want to have that image fit again. So you can fill the grid proportionately again, or we can also enlarge this so we can get kind of back that little bit more interesting crop if we need to. But keep that in mind, just customize the crop for your image so that it's not just filling in with whatever it happened to be, that like the image was created. Just customize things for yourself a little bit. All right, so let's take a look at the headline, and then you also end up with, not having that awkward text wrap right there. Now let's take a look at the headline here. This headline has some issues. For one thing, it's kind of small. It doesn't really have a lot of impact. It also has one of those fonts that I told you about. This is one of those fonts that we want to try to avoid. Apple Chancery. It's kind of like one of the only calligraphy looking fonts that come with the basic Office software. And so it's overused a lot. Plus, it doesn't work very well in all caps, right? That's one of the type rules, is not to use script or calligraphy fonts in all caps. That's not what they're designed to be. So here I would recommend that you find a bolder font, something that works better for a headline. This one right here is bold, and it's also a little bit unique. You can tell that it's come from the Adobe fonts right here, because I have it checked and installed. So why don't we pick that one instead for something a little bit more interesting, and let's make it as large as we can. Always try to make the headlines as large as you can, and if you're trying to do things that are aligned and you want to keep with your grid, it would be great if you could make it fit across at least the whole top of the page, or at least a few columns. And that can be a little bit difficult at times, because you just have to sit here and guess and guess and guess how large to make it. But if you highlight it, you can just kind of sit and click on your sizes right here until you see that it fits. Okay, well, it got a little too big. If you get to that, and then the next point up, it gets too big, well, there's other ways to fill out the rest of the space, and the tracking is one of them. So you can continue with the tracking here, add a little extra tracking. The other thing might also be that if your box is not big enough, not just lengthwise but widthwise, then it might look like it doesn't fit. So I've added a little bit of tracking, and now let's see if I can't add, another point or two to make it fit. And there we go. Now it's fitting across the whole top, and it has a lot bigger impact than the previous one, right? Some other issues that we see here now is that things aren't aligned, so we need to take this text box, align it with the image right there, and this text box as well. It looks like that one did not wrap around once we made that image bigger, so we want to pull this down so that it's not behind there. And of course, if you have your text boxes threaded, it should just flow through to another part. All right, so now let's take a little bit of a look at the body copy right here. And make sure that you always, use the paragraph styles to help you as you go through and try different things. This is a very quick way to be able to make changes to the fonts and the other settings of the body copy and the text, so that you don't have to sit and wonder about things. So let's see. The body copy, if you are checking that out, just want you to kind of see here. I'm going to move this over. Let me just see if I can get it. We can move this over as far as we can this way, and then open up this. Sometimes it's a little bit hard. I think these windows are sometimes so big. But I want you to be able to see what's happening here because I'm clicking the preview, what happens when we make some changes to the body copy. Keep in mind, fonts for body copy, you want to keep with classic, easy to read. You don't want to use any kind of fanciful or really dramatic kind of fonts for the body copy so you can read it. You want to always keep with a regular style. You don't want to use italics or bolds or anything like that for your body copy. And sizes is recommended between 8 and 12. So it kind of depends on the font, but I would stay away from 8. Usually is probably too small. 12 is a default size, so it kind of tends to look a little clunky. So I would go around 10 or 11 most of the time for your body copy sizes. And you can always add a little bit of tracking if you want to, but you don't want to add too much. Notice what happens if I keep adding tracking to this text. Okay, let's see. Has it not been applied? Oh, the body copy has not been applied here. So notice what happens if I keep adding tracking to this body copy. If it gets really wide, it kind of chops up all the words and it makes it a lot harder to read, even though this just has placeholder font just for this demonstration, even though you shouldn't do that for your projects. Okay, so you can always add a little bit of tracking if you feel like the copy feels tight, but I wouldn't do too much. Same thing with the leading. The automatic leading is usually fine to go with. If you add too much leading, again, it kind of disrupts the flow of the text. But also, of course, if your leading is too tight, it's going to make the text feel really compressed and also hard to read. So that's why the auto leading is a good way to start, and then you can adjust it a little bit from there if you need to. In your body copy paragraph styles, I would also go in and set your indents and spacing. This is where you can change your paragraph separations. And so this is where you could have that first line indent if you decide to do that. But also if you already have space between the paragraphs, like you can see right here, you don't need to do that, right? You can see that there's space after paragraphs listed right here. So if you don't have that space, well, then you're going to need some way to separate the paragraphs, and you can do that little first line indent to show that up. Or, but this is usually feels pretty heavy for magazine articles and things like that, and that's where the space between the paragraphs is usually better. And I usually put it in after. That way it doesn't interfere with any subheadings as much. Okay. All right, so we'll fix that setting on our body copy. Now, speaking of paragraph headings, or subheadings. You can see that there are a couple in here. They're just called new paragraph. And the only way that they have been shown up is with an underline. So that is probably not the most effective way to show that up. Underlining kind of makes things feel like they are a link. So I would stay away from that as a way to emphasize things. And I would probably just create a separate paragraph style for subheadings. And and pick actually a different type of font, either a different font family, like you could do a contrasting font like a sans serif font, or something that's similar to what you're using in your headline. Or if you want to use the same family, then you can use like a bold style and maybe something that is a little bit larger. Now I didn't, actually, let me highlight one of these subheadings so we can kind of see what to do here. And let's, while we're at that, let's see, is there underlining over here? Yeah, let's take off the underline and let's add new paragraph style for this and call this subheading. And then let's see what we can do here for your basic characters. Let's just do the bold version. And then let's enlarge the size a little bit. Now our body copy was 11. So you want it to have at least 2 points difference so that it shows up and you can tell the difference. You can even do something like putting it in all caps if you want to. Of course, you can't do that in the paragraph settings, so you'd have to go in there and type that in. But now you can see that it has a little bit more contrast with the rest of the text. And you can also go in here with the indents and spacing and add a little bit of space after this, again, to kind of separate it a little bit from the rest of the text. You want to try to have your subheading still closer to the paragraph that it's supposed to title, rather than having it hang right in the middle between the previous paragraph and the oncoming paragraph. All right, so let's apply that. That seems, you know, if I wanted this to be all caps, I can go in here and change that in this button right here to give it even more contrast if you want to. And then I'm finding my other paragraph subheading right here. So I'm just going to go in and I'm going to click that subheading paragraph style. And it should have, and we want to remove the underline and add the bolded. There we go. All right, so now though, you can see that we have a big issue right here happening right here with the changes that we have made. You have a pull quote that's inserted right here. It feels kind of long to read. It doesn't really have enough contrast to the text. And when you're wrapping your text around another text box, you got to be really careful what's happening with that text. You can see right now it becomes, these lines right here become really short. That is, if you have a 3-column grid, I would totally recommend that you don't have any text wraps with that, because anything that you wrap in, it's always going to be too short. In a 3-column grid on a regular page, your lines are kind of like as short as they should be. If you have a 2-column grid, you have a little bit more leeway with doing text wraps, but I would stay away from it when you are in a 3-column grid. So let's just take this pull quote and let it fill the whole entire column so that we have a little bit, you know, we get rid of that issue right there. But depending on where you put this pull quote, you're also interrupting the text in kind of an awkward spot right here, right? Because we're starting to read this paragraph and then there's just one line left after the pull quote. So let's think about where we are putting this pull quote, maybe moving it so that it fits between in a paragraph break anyway, right? Because then that's going to be a little bit easier for people to handle. But like I said, it's still pretty small. It still doesn't quite stand out as much as I think that a pull quote should. So let's do a few things to this as well. Let's make the text maybe bold, italic. Okay, that can help. You can even do a paragraph style for the pull quote if you want to, so that you can apply it to several different pull quotes if you have several pages in an article. Then it's always good to do that. And I would probably have the text be a little bit bigger. Okay. When you're going through to with some of this text, you can kind of determine and see so that you don't have any awkward hyphens or anything like that. Another way to have the pull quote kind of stand out a little bit more is to put a colored background on this text box. So let's do that so that we can see that it stands out a little bit, or you can even color the text. But I wanted to show you some things about having the text box colored anyway. So let's go in here. I have color in here already that I kind of picked from the background over here in the image. It's always a good thing to have some kind of repetition when it comes to your colors. So I'm putting that in there. But the text is really tight to the edges of this box, and it becomes very obvious when it's colored. So the way to fix that is to go to your object and your text frame options, Command B. And in this little panel, you can add little buffer spacing between the text and the edge of your text box. So for the top, for example, I can put in a little buffer right there. See what's happening there, how it's moving it down from the top. And I can do it from, oh, you can see that this is locked. So now it's actually adding the same space all the way around, top, bottom, left, and right. If you want to customize that a little bit more, you can do unlock this, and then you can add a little bit more to the top, but maybe not so much to the sides. But what we see now too is that it makes it so that the whole quote is not fitting in here. So I can call that okay. Make my box a little bit bigger to see if we can get the name in there. I don't like the way that that has a widow in it now. So now I'm going to go in and change the size of this a little bit. Or maybe just change the tracking like we talked about. That's a good way to get rid of some widows. So I'm just going to add a little bit of tracking there. And once that I see that it jumps down so that that last word is not alone, then I'm fine. Okay. So that's a way to make sure that you have a little bit of buffer space around text that's in any kind of box or anything like that. As we look through this, you will also see some, if you wanted to check out for widows and orphans, you want to do it after you have fixed it, kind of the last thing that you do, because when you go through and if you're fixing spacing or fonts or sizes or anything like that, those are going to change anyway. So widows and orphans is one of the last things you'll take a look at. Let's see what we've got going on here. Okay, there's a couple of widows. There's one right there. And there is a really bad problem right up here, which is a hyphenated orphan. You really want to stay away from orphans more than anything. That is when like a last line or a last word from a previous paragraph is ending up in a different column, or even on a different page. That really interrupts the flow and the reading flow for um, the reader. All right, so one way that we could maybe fix this is by checking on our hyphenations. So let's go back to our body copy paragraph style, and let's take a look at that hyphenation. And it says hyphenate, and you can change here if you want, better spacing, fewer hyphens. You can put things in there that are, I'm going to do a little bit more. And it's funny here because I don't really see any hyphens in here, so I don't know why this is not applying necessarily to all of this text. Yeah, I don't see any hyphens in here, so I don't know why that that hyphenation doesn't seem to be working necessarily here. Let's take a look at our characters. Look at a paragraph right here. It has hyphens checked. So I'm not really sure why the hyphens aren't showing up. Maybe it's because we have filler text. That could be the reason. But that's one way that you can check on things and see if that works. If that doesn't work, we can always try what we talked about as far as some adding a little bit of tracking. So let's take a look at what happens to this one and this one once we add a little tracking. Okay, look like we own, and that's up to 20. So we can actually go in here and then just do it manually. Let's do 15. That didn't seem like it did much. Let's go to 20. I think the text is pretty easy to read still. And you can see that that took care of our issue up here. It didn't necessarily take care of this one right here. But again, that can be maybe not the worst thing. So, so as long as it takes care of the orphan up there and doesn't cause any other big issues, then maybe you can live with that. But remember, once you do one thing, it's ripple effect and it's going to affect other things. So now I have to move my pull quote a little bit because that had that awkward break in that paragraph otherwise. So you want to make sure that you have nice text flow between your paragraphs and anything else that you have in there, like subheadings or different columns or inserted things like images or pull quotes or anything like that. One recommendation I do is that you kind of pretend that you're the reader and kind of just skim through the text and see if there's any place where you feel like things are becoming difficult to read or awkward or annoying, and then you fix that part of it. Now I wanted to show you something about bullet tabs, and because I changed the size of this text, and I mean the size of the image right here, my part that had bullets on it is not showing anymore. So let me just delete that paragraph so we can see some of these bullets down here that I had in my bullet list. And now I'm going to have to move this again. There we go. All right, so on this bullet list right here, you might notice that the text is kind of far away from the bullets. And this is another kind of pet peeve, annoying thing that interrupts the flow for the reader and makes it hard for them to kind of associate the text to the bullet. So that can actually be changed if you have created a bullet paragraph style. That can be changed right there. So you see that bullet paragraph style has different settings on it, and the bullets are changed and look different. So let's take a look at this bullet paragraph style where that is, where you can make those changes. Under bullets and numbering, here you can change what the bullet looks like, so you can change it to a different style of bullet. You can align things, and you can also have indents so that the whole bullet list indents more, like that. This tab position also changes how far away the text is from the bullet itself. So if I change that, you can see that it's moving away from the bullet, or it's moving closer to the bullet. So that's some things that you can do over in the bullet paragraph style options. You can see this one here also gives a little bit of extra space between each one of the bullets. And that would be under the indents and spacing. Here as well, you can see that there's that space after. So if you want them to be closer together, you can just take that away, and then each one of the bullets are closer together. All right, so those are some of the things that you can see with just a little bit of adjustments. The whole layout is now much easier to read. Let's save this one as revised. And then open up both of them, actually. And then with our preview, and this is, I also like to toggle this W or change here in the preview, so you can kind of see what it looks like without your guides and things in an easier way. But here you go. This was our before. What's going on here? This is our after, right? So notice how much easier and how much more interesting this one feels than this one right here. All of the kind of problems and what should I say? Oh, I wish I could have it just a little bit bigger so we can see it. But how kind of jumbled and inconsistent and unprofessional this one feels compared to something like this. So pay attention to those little different things that I put on the list, and remember that you have a bunch of resources right here in your lynda.com playlist. The downloads for layouts and typography, and the Adobe tutorials, and also these design refreshers that I've listed in the announcements that you can go to get some more help to start your revisions on your projects this week. So our next session will be Wednesday at 4 p.m. Mountain Time, where we will do a resume critique. So if you don't have your resume turned in yet, try to get it turned in today so that it can be part of tomorrow's critique. Or Wednesday's critique, rather. If you can't attend, you must watch the recording so that you can get the needed feedback, because assessment 2B, that is due on Saturday, is including your revisions on your resumes. All right, so we'll see you at Wednesday at 4 p.m. Same Zoom channel, same Zoom time.